all of you a good afternoon, and we want to say thank you for joining us for this session. We are going to talk about food safety culture. So let me introduce again myself. I am Jun Barnes, and I am the Regional Customer Education Manager for Neogen Asia Pacific. I will be the moderator for the session, but I will also be one of the speakers for this webinar. So I just want to repeat once again that this is being brought to you by Neogen. We provide tools for the industry for ensuring quality and safety of your food products. And just in case you want to know more about these solutions, don't hesitate to connect with our Neogen team members and distribution partners in your country. We have provided you with tools, but more than that, we are also providing you with quality education and training programs in order to support food safety and quality in your organizations. From webinars just like the one that we are having this afternoon to in-person events, we offer a comprehensive range of online and in-person activities or trainings that would help you deepen your expertise on food safety. And to help us stay current on the latest food safety topics and technologies, we have partnered with leading industry experts, just like the one we are having this afternoon, to provide you with the most relevant content. So let's now begin our webinar, which will focus on food safety beyond compliance, understanding the impact of culture in food safety practices. We are doing this because we want to answer the request that you have extended to us. We conducted a survey this year, and the top topic that was requested in APAC was food safety culture. I am very proud that at Neogen Corporation, food safety culture has been our focus for quite some time. And we are also very fortunate to have worked with three of the most prominent supporters of food safety culture. Our journey on this topic started in the early 2000s with Dr. Chris Griffith. He is a consultant and editor, and he was able to introduce the concept of food safety culture among food manufacturers in APAC. Since then, we have deepened our focus on food safety culture through impactful collaborations. We've conducted several webinars and in-person events with Dr. Lone Jesperson. She is the principal and founder of Cultivate SA. And just recently, this was last year, we were honored to have Frank Llanas. He is an author, another champion of food safety culture, and he happens to be the former Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. During the event that was held in Japan, he was able to share his insights on food safety culture. Now, in our session this afternoon, we are very excited because we are revisiting this topic once again through a fresh lens with Dr. Chay Lay Ching. This session is especially meaningful because she is going to present their research on how food safety knowledge and attitudes intersect with actual food safety practices. So you're probably doing a lot of trainings in your company and you're wondering, are our trainings really working to cause a behavioral change among our employees so that our practice of food safety will be strengthened? Well, aside from that, Dr. Chay will also be sharing her experience in developing a food safety culture assessment tool for SMEs in Malaysia. This was actually a project that they conducted in collaboration with the Food Safety and Quality Department of the Ministry of Health of Malaysia. Really useful topics that I'm really hoping will be able to contribute to your understanding of the kind of culture that exists in your company through the talks that will be provided by Dr. Chay Lay Ching. So I just want to inform all of you that aside from Dr. Chay Lay Ching, I will also serve as a speaker for this session. So let me take this time to introduce ourselves to all of you. I'll start by introducing Dr. Chay Lay Ching. She happens to be one of the most respected and awarded scientists in Malaysia and a sought-after speaker on topics including microbiology, and food safety. She pursued a Bachelor of Science degree in biotechnology from University Putra, Malaysia, where she also completed her PhD. Her specialization lies in food microbiology, focusing on foodborne and waterborne pathogens, microbial safety in the food chain, and microbial risk assessment. Currently, she serves as a professor in Sunway University in Malaysia. I, on the other hand, bring with me 20 years of experience in microbiology and food safety, working very closely with the food industry. Prior to my being part of Neogen, I served as an educator in one of the premier universities in the Philippines on microbiology, and I also got to work as a microbiology laboratory manager in a multinational company in Mindanao here in the Philippines. I am currently the Regional Customer Education Manager for Neogen Asia Pacific. Again, I believe all of you are already very excited. So without further ado, let me now pass on the virtual stage to Dr. Chay Lay Ching. Hi, Dr. Chay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Jun. Sure. Thank you so much to Jun, for such a kind introduction. And a very good afternoon to everyone. So I'm actually live in from my office right now from Kuala Lumpur. My connection is a bit unstable over here. So please allow me to just switch off my camera and I will start my sharing with you on today's topic that we are going to explore food safety culture. So when we talk about food safety culture, so a lot of time we do link food safety culture with having high food safety knowledge and having a positive attitude. But my question over here is that, do you really think that food safety knowledge and positive attitude do definitely lead to better food safety? Food safety knowledge and attitude to the real practices. So this is one study that my team has worked on to really look into food safety knowledge, attitude, as well as the self-reported practices. And we try to actually connect and link it to the real scenario of hygiene in the canteens. So we have sampled 67 food handlers in the canteen, and we found that their food safety knowledge is actually quite average, 61.7%. However, the attitude was extremely, extremely positive, that all of them think that they do play an important role in ensuring food safety or the safety or the food condition that they serve to their customers. And they need to always increase the knowledge, do their best, to serve the most safe food, to the customer. And the self-reported practices over here score really high too, 53.2% of 60, which means that they do have the knowledge. They do know that they need to wash their hands after handling, some of the things, cutting meat, for example, go to toilet, and so on and so forth. However, the reality show that when we sample all the food handlers' hand who participate in this study, that actually 65% of the food handlers' hand carry more than 20 CFU per cm square of bacteria on their hand. And out of this number, 48% of the food handlers do carry salmonella on their hand due to constant serving of chicken dish in the canteen itself. So my question over here is that, no, it doesn't show that, with positive attitude, as well as with knowledge, it does necessarily link to a good practices. So the next study, we continue, to work on a different region, in Malaysia. So this is actually a collaboration with ministry also, and we do actually publish the work, this is also on KAP. So what we have found that there is this gap, in self-reported practices and the observed food safety behavior. So we have conducted this study in one of the states, like in Malaysia, that 117 foreign food handlers were involved in the study. So there was a weak and significant correlation between knowledge, attitude, and practices. It does show that with good knowledge, so there's an improvement in terms of attitudes as well as reported practices. However, when we do the observation, so the officer actually went to the shop and sit down and really observe, like, how do they practice? So just one of the example to show you over here, that the hand washing before handling food, that 95% of the food handlers do report that they do wash hands, like, before they actually handle food. But in our observation, so we observe only 50% of the food handlers actually do so. So the observed practice the mean score of the observed practices do score significantly lower compared to the self-reported practices over here. So our research, and you can actually gather more research, it does show that there's this discrepancy between self-reported practices, knowledge, attitude, to real practices. So why do gaps persist, between food handlers' self-reported practices and their actual behavior, even with knowledge and with positive attitudes toward food safety? So when we do all this observation, doing our study, we do ask, the food handlers, why do you think that you are not following? Because we said, you have reported that you will wash your hand, before you handle food. But in reality, you actually do not do it. So then these are some of the feedback, or the comments that we get, they say, didn't I do it? I think I've forgotten. So some say, my boss told me to follow this way, just ignore the correct way of doing. So for example, in most of the restaurant, they do, they need to actually use, different chopping boards, for cooked food and raw food. But the boss said, oh yeah, use only one chopping board and keep the good one, for the next use to save money. So there are also some say, we don't have enough tools or materials to follow. I just don't have enough detergents. I need to save one bottle for 1 month. And some say, I'm just too busy. I have no time to follow. And some say, too many rules, I cannot remember. And another one said, who will follow? Nobody follow. So rules are just rules. So to be printed and not to be followed. And some say, it's okay, to miss once or twice. We are human anyway. And there are some also say, I do not know, I need to do this. And some say, it's okay, I do the same at home and I never fall sick. So all of these different responses from the food handler do show that there are these either the reason for not following is probably due to the top-down decision, that's what the boss said, or it's just it's my culture, I do the same at home, so it should be okay, that I do it in the restaurant. So there are many reasons, why there's this disconnection between between knowledge and attitude, to the real practices. So you could try this out, in your own setting to see whether if you get the same response. So I think what is more important right now is that knowing that there is this discrepancy, so what strategies can be implemented to actually ensure consistent food safety practices in real world settings? Is it true, since there's this discrepancy, whatever, when you have high knowledge, you have positive attitude, it doesn't really necessarily translating to real practices. Does it mean that we do not now need to train our workers? Does it mean that we do not need to improve their attitude? So the answer is no. So, but there's these gaps in the middle. Without good practice, without good knowledge, without positive attitude, no matter what you do, you won't be able to translate things into real practices. So what is missing over here is actually culture. So what is actually culture? So now we are talking about food safety culture. In general, we always talk about culture. So culture refers to shared values, beliefs, customs, languages, norms, as well as material artifacts that characterize a group or a society. It definitely defines how people live, how people interact, and how we understand the world around us. So generally, that describe what is culture. So we always say, like, you know, as a Malaysian has this culture of very relaxing or, like, you know, very forgiving. So as a Filipino, probably the culture is like, you know, happy-go-lucky and so on and so forth. So this culture do define, like, you know, this special category of people or a group of society, how they live, how they interact, and how they react, and how they actually understand the world around them. So in general, that's culture. So when we talk about, like, you know, people working in the kitchen, in a food production entities, so we are talking about food safety culture. So how do we build that culture that actually define how food handler interact, live, and understand food safety? So this photo show you, like, you know, a railway station, like, you know, with a lot of people queuing up in a very, very tidy manner. Where do you think this is? So definitely not in Malaysia, right? So where do you think this is? This would be. So probably, like, you know, quite a number of you, like, you know, probably would have already guessed, like, you know, this probably is Japan. So if I went to Japan, I got, like, you know, very, very, like, really amazed that people are actually queuing up, and I don't really see a sign, like, you know, that actually ask people to queue up. People come in, generally, like, you know, people just queue up, right? So that is actually a culture. And as you could see, like, you know, these really define a certain group of people. So this culture is invisible, but very powerful force that guides actions, fostering collective cooperation and adherence to norms without the need for constant reminder. So that's culture. When we talk about culture, so it's something that people do. This is normally and common things that people do. People do not ask why. Why do I need to queue up? Why do I need to wash my hand? But why are you not queuing up, or why are you not washing your hand after going to toilet? So that has become a culture when people stop asking why, but just do, because that has become a norm. So when we talk about food safety culture, so food safety culture refers to shared values, belief, attitudes, and practices that we actually perform and maintain on a day-to-day basis. It covers mindset, it covers behaviors of everyone that involved in the food supply chain, from top management to food handlers. And it reflects how seriously food safety is prioritized and integrated within the daily operation. So that is food safety culture. When we talk about food safety culture, it really reflects the correct practices being followed when no one is watching. That is food safety culture. So what is lacking over here is, like, you know, that this is something that needs to be done, and we do not need people to tell. So in fact, when people ask you, why are you using different chopping board for different food? And they will ask you, why not? This is what's supposed to be. So even though they may not understand why they need to separate chopping board, but they are just doing it. So that's culture. So that is, like, you know, the gap that we feel is missing, that's connecting knowledge and attitude as well to the real practices. So knowing what food safety culture is, what is most important thing to do is actually how to build the food safety culture. So a strong food safety culture actually ensures, like, you know, that you have leadership commitment, employee behavior, like, you know, that's where all the knowledge and where all the attitude that actually comes in. And communication. So what need to be communicated? There's a clear communication plan about food safety expectation. So they will tell you that, no, this is my role, like, you know, or I need to do this to ensure, like, you know, that the food produced are actually safe. So there's clear communication, what needs to be done and how to do it. Training and education, like, you know, to make sure that I know this is important, but I know how and what to do. and accountability, then everyone feel that this is their responsibility and their role to play to ensure that the food is actually safe. So what shaped food safety culture? And basically by understanding what shaped food safety culture, it tells us how to actually build and develop food safety culture within your food manufacturing setting or your restaurant. There are various categorization of all these different elements, but generally there are 9 elements that we need to look into, as these 9 elements shape food safety culture. The first one is definitely leadership commitment. So a clear leadership commitment, like, this is important, telling everyone that food safety is very important and this is priority, and we are doing all we could, to ensure that the food that we produce are actually safe. From the top management, from the leaders, is actually extremely important. In particular, when we talk about Asian setting, Asian culture. So I will talk about it later on, why is it extremely important for the Asian culture, that leadership commitment is extremely important. Then the next one is employee behavior and attitudes, that we talk about, how the employee show positive attitudes, that yes, I will always try my best, to learn the most important food safety things that I need to do, and so on and so forth. Employee actually show that yes, I do want to do food safety and this is my role. So all of these are one of the very important elements that need to be built. Then the next one is communication and collaboration. So when we look at the whole food manufacturing setting, so you can't produce food by yourself, but you work as a team. So when you are working as a team, so it's about collaboration. When it's about collaboration, you are working together as a team, you need to communicate in a way. So how do you communicate? Language use, verbal language, non-verbal language, these are all part of communication, to share and to show information, to share and to show messages so that you could collaborate and work as a team. So another important element would be training and education. So when we talk about training, when we talk about education, so even though I could have good behavior and attitude, I may not know what to do. I may not know that by doing so, this is actually causing cross-contamination of food. So therefore, trainings and education need to be provided so that the employee can translate that into real action, into real practices. So training and education is extremely important in shaping food safety culture. External pressures, what's happening outside, who is actually pushing for food safety culture. So it could be internally, there's a need to do this food safety culture, but there's external pressure in certain country, when you produce food, this food is to be exported to certain country, and that the regulation is very strict and they require high standard of food safety. That's actually external pressure to push you to now work more stringently, to produce food in a better manner. So that is external pressure that come in. So within a country, some hazard is compulsory, some hazard is not compulsory. These are all external pressure that shape the environment. Then the next one is resources and infrastructure. Is resources and infrastructure enough for you to carry out and to practice food safety culture? So those are equally important too, but can be easily resolved, if the top management, the leadership do have that direction do have that commitment. Yes, we need to put food safety as a priority, and therefore these can be invested easily. So organizational priority, what is that priority that we are talking about for an organization? So are you talking about let's prioritize profit than safety, or do we prioritize long-term goal than a short-term goal? So these will definitely define how food safety culture could be shaped or are being communicated within an organization. Then the next one that today, we are going to talk a lot more, and that's actually a neglection, which is social and cultural factors. Social and cultural factors perhaps is one of the most difficult factors to deal with, like, in shaping food safety culture. So in any region or country, it depends on how the society or in a cultural aspect, we actually view food safety culture or food safety practices, in a way to say. So we will come to it later on. And finally, recognition and reward systems, whether a recognition and reward system is actually put in, like, to recognize and to reward those who have done good. So this is just similar as, like, in any country, in any society, that you actually jail the bad man and you actually reward those who has done good. So this system needs to be done in a fair manner so that it send and communicate real commitment in food safety. So all of these need to be aligned so that we as an employee or a worker sense and gather information and understand what culture an organization want to have. So that's a food safety culture. So I'm not going to go in too much detail of each of the elements, as I've already explained. You would have this slide, so you could go through, like, all the details, what define leadership commitment. The top-down influence is extremely important in Asian culture. So we will look into it why later on when we talk about the Western and Asian or the Eastern culture over here. So employee behavior, how to shape, like, the personal accountability through training, awareness, campaign, and so on and so forth. Communication and collaboration. Sometimes we do communicate, but is it an effective communication? Nobody look into it. So we merely or simply just say and send something, but we do not really check whether if it is the message is received correctly and effectively. So this is something to look into. Training and education. One thing to talk about training is about continuous training. Is it a continuous training? Is it tailored, like, to really work on some aspect that your worker lack? So do you know what is lacking? What we have already trained too many times, like, actually is very well received, that we should actually stop training and set up, like, how frequent do you train your workers? So what is the frequency that work and not working? So these are all something that we need to look into, like, when you tailor and design your training and education within your organization. External pressure. So I talk about regulation. A lot of time when we talk about external pressures, we think about regulation. But a lot of time, like, if customer requirement is actually an important external pressures. And there are also these differences, like, between region or country to country. To a lot of developed countries, so food safety requirement, a lot of time is pushed by their customers, as customers are very well informed. So when they focus very much organic food is very important, then they would actually pay more for organic food and not buying non-organic food or chemical planted vegetables or whatsoever. Then the industry have to just follow the customer needs and therefore produce more organic food and so on and so forth. When the customers are very well aware of the danger of so and so, then it will actually push for change. So I think this scenario is, like, coming very soon also, like, in Asia or in when a country is way more developed right now. So then resources and infrastructure, like, the investment in safety tools and infrastructure. So how many sampling do I need to do? Where should I sample? Although, like, I understand this is very important, and I do think that we need to do more monitoring, but there's very little investment by the top management on food safety tool, on sampling, on monitoring, even though my top leaders, my bosses say, oh yeah, food safety is very important, but they do not invest. So there's a misalignment in the message sent to the general public, like, what is actually important, a general, workers or employees within the organization. Then this misalignment is a very clear misalignment in terms of communication. So this is something to look into also. Then organizational priorities. So profit versus safety. So a lot of time when we talk about profit versus safety, a lot of time is actually long-term and short-term thinking. So what is important? A lot of times safety or producing safe food, quality food do link very much to profit. So there's this balance which is needed, like, in terms of long-term, short-term thinking, profit versus safety, and it's forever, like, something that we can spend 1 hour to talk about and to discuss on it. Social and cultural factors, like, what is these cultural influences? What are the social norms, like, that the employee have about safe food handling? So in Malaysia, we do have these news that came out really, like, hot on social media. It's like, one of the consumer actually took a photo of a foreign worker washing or preparing food or put, like, cooked food by a drainage in Malaysia. So this become a huge, like, news on social media, as this is not the correct culture or norms. Like, we see this is not safe. We say, like, this is not hygienic. So, but when we, like, go around, really interview, ask, like, the foreign worker, why do you do this? Like, why do you cook food by the drainage? So that's what they say. We used to do this at home in my own country. This is okay. So I don't think there's a problem. So these are all the differences, the social and cultural norms. So when you involve, like, when you're a foreign worker, like, in your setting, so how do you align and balance, or how do you educate your foreign workers, like, about the norms and the culture that we need to practice over here right now? So to change the mindset, particularly when we talk about social norms, it's not really something that easy to do, and it will take time. That's why I said, like, this element perhaps is the most difficult elements to deal with. And finally, recognition and reward systems, as I said, like, incentive need to be given, campaign, but how is it being given? What is being given? Like, how to recognize and to reward. So those are something that perhaps, like, are influenced by a larger culture and social norms that we will actually go into in a moment. So how do we measure food safety culture? Definitely you will need the tool, like, to measure food safety culture, or else you would not know where you stand. What is the lacking? Is it because communication, misalignment, or is it lack of top management commitment, or is it because lack of investment, or is it because of low self-esteem, low attitude? What is it, like, that we are lacking that actually stop us from forming that positive food safety culture within, like, our setting over here? And when I talk about social norms, like, is there a difference between the Western social norm and the Eastern social norm or the Asian social norm? And this is actually affecting how we actually develop food safety culture. And that's why we are working on developing a food safety culture assessment tool for small, medium enterprise, like, food producing, food manufacturer in Malaysia. So this clearly integrate the local culture and norms within the system itself, like, for us to actually do a more accurate measurement of our food safety culture. What may be okay, like, in the Western culture, or normal in the Western culture, may be something that is very foreign over here, that either does it work or is not working over here. We need to actually decide and put in, like, our strategies, like, how to improve it. So how do we build a positive food safety culture? So a lot of time, what has been done, like, to build, so quite a number of factories, I know that you have already started building your food safety culture, knowing it or not knowingly doing, has already starting to build. So a lot of time, like, you put a lot of very high priority on regulations and standard, as well as monitoring and enforcement. The QA, QC works just like a police station, policeman, like, going around and check, and compliance. We always talk about compliance. That is extremely on the highest priority. By doing so, we think that we would be able to build a food safety culture within our organization, but it may not be. So there's still something lacking. Some company, like, do one step forward extra, which is, like, to really put some effort in doing education training, in equipping, like, facilities and tools that a lot of times have higher priority in a lot of food manufacturing company. And some put in, not all, do have a recognition and reward systems. This oftentimes, like, has a lower priority. I do it, like, because, like, I just want to make my worker happy. And yes, like, I have learned somewhere that this is important, but it has never become, like, the most important thing to do in shaping the food safety culture in an entity. Practice food safety the goal over here is actually to ensure that all your workers actually practice food safety consistently, even when people are not watching. And what we are seeing is that it does not necessarily work with all the strategies that has already been put in. So I just want to show one of the case, we have just one of the silver lining of COVID-19 definitely tell us and tell everyone and even the world that microorganism, the pathogen, safety, hygiene, all this is very important. So let us look into the practice of face masks, during COVID-19. So we have seen, totally different scenario between the East and the West. So in Asia, so everyone automatically put on face masks, without the need to tell. So you don't even need to tell them that you need to put on, and they ask you why, and I'm not going to put on. So that is automatic, in the Eastern culture. In most of the Asian country, nobody said I would not put on a face mask. I just put on a face mask. But in the West, this is totally different, despite the fact that their government tell them that you have to put on a face mask as we are hit by coronavirus. So we are hit by COVID-19. But we do see a huge demonstration and asking this is against my human right. Why should I put on a face mask? This is wrong for government to tell me to put on a face mask. So you get totally different response from the Western country. So have you ever wondered why? Why is it so, even though it's the same thing that has been consistently done in the East and in the West? Same strategy. The government tell the public that there's this huge epidemic spread right now. COVID-19 is in the spread and a lot of people die. Therefore, put on your face mask to protect you yourself and to protect others that you love. It works in the Eastern country. It never worked in the Western country. So this is because there's these differences in terms of culture. Societal norms that we say. So I just want to bring you to this Gerd Hofstede cultural dimensions theory. So in Gerd Hofstede cultural dimension theory, it listed 6 cultural dimensions to describe a society. So a society can be described in terms of culture based on power distance, how the people view and accept the level of power. How do you accept or follow instruction from your top management? That's power distance. Certain country has very horizontal practices compared to in Asia. Most of the time, our power distance is huge. We usually will respect our leaders and we will follow instruction. But this may not work in certain countries, particularly in the West. Individualism versus collectivism. Some countries, they prioritize very much individual goal rather than group goal. So Asian country, a lot of time is very much collectivism. We work as a group, as a team, rather than as individual. Masculine versus feminine. A masculine culture is mainly driven by competition. So very competitive culture, very competitive country. So everyone want to win. So everyone is very aggressive. That's masculine culture within a country. Or it can be feminine culture that focus or highlight more on cooperation. Let's work together. Let's partner. We want harmony, within our culture. That's feminism culture. Then the next one is uncertainty avoidance. So the desire to accept or to avoid unknown or uncertain situations. How do you deal with uncertainty when things are not clear? So are you comfortable or not comfortable with this uncertainty? How do you deal? How do you manage? Long-term orientation, is it short-term or long-term goal that a country or society is focusing on? And finally, indulgence versus restraint. So these describe the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. So whether you are indulgent or you are the restraint type that you would actually follow, you focus on self-discipline. So that's restraint. So these actually show you, like, we categorize each of the country, like, Hofstede actually categorize each of the country or region based on these 6 cultural dimensions. So whether your power distance index high or low. So high means that high hierarchical cultures, like, your society have hierarchy. Some country do not have hierarchy, like Denmark, like New Zealand. So they focus egalitarian cultures. So everyone's are equal. So there's no hierarchy in the culture. Therefore, I would not just follow whatever you tell me to do. Then individualism and collectivism. So individualistic country like USA, UK, a lot of Western country focus very much on your own achievement. You value personal achievement, you value independence. While collectivism, like, a lot of Asian countries are collectivistic. So we focus on group loyalty, family ties, community goal, and emphasize on all of this. Feminine and masculine, I've already mentioned. Japan, Germany are very masculine culture. So focus very much on ambition, success, assertiveness. Whereas, like, Sweden, Netherlands probably very much value cooperation, modesty, well-being. Uncertainty avoidance, like, Greece and Portugal, for example, have high uncertainty avoidance. They want to follow rules. I cannot accept there's uncertainty. I will only follow rules. So everything need to have a clear instruction. Whereas country with low uncertainty avoidance index, we are extremely comfortable with uncertainty, with ambiguity. So we always focus more on, there's always way to make things work, innovation. So that is actually low uncertainty avoidance. We are extremely okay. When we do not know how to do, we will just make it work as we wish. So short-term or long-term focus or emphasize on perseverance, on planning, on pragmatism, like China, South Korea. Where short-term focus on tradition, quick results, social obligation, like USA and so forth. Indulgence and restraint. Indulgence value freedom, leisure, personal happiness, like USA. Why putting on masks, like, becomes such a wrong thing to do? So it's because they focus on indulgence. I value freedom. You cannot tell me what to do. It's my freedom to decide what I wear and what I do not wear. Whereas restraint focus on self-discipline, social norms. This is what people do, and therefore I will follow. When people do not do this, I won't do. So I will just try to make sure that I am aligned with the social norm, what everyone is doing. I do not try to be different. So that's restraint, self-discipline. So a lot of, I think, Asian culture are very much towards restraint. So as we are working, like, to develop this tool for Malaysia, so we actually focus, like, to really look at how Hofstede culture describe Malaysia culture. So Malaysia is very much authority, is respected. Very high power distance index means that it's a hierarchical society. Even in any setting in government, is hierarchical. Whatever, like, the boss said, the leader said, we will follow. That's power distance index. Therefore, when we apply these, like, in setting up food safety culture in any organization, the top-down decision message from the leaders is actually very, very important. So therefore, like, whatever being said and say will actually lead and guide the formation of the culture within an entity or organization in way easier manner. So if your boss do not say so, then a lot of time you can say whatever you like, it will not be practiced. So that's the fact and the reality. Individualistic or collectivistic. So Malaysia is very much, like, collectivistic, and masculine, feminine in the middle. So high or low uncertainty, extremely low, and therefore, like, rules and regulations are present, but are not rigidly enforced. So it's there, but we are not following. But what will actually influence more? Power. So top-down decision. So leaderships is very important. Long-term, short-term goal around in the middle, I would say. So indulgence or restraint also right, very much, like, in the middle. But religion and cultural values do play an important role in Malaysia's setting. And therefore, when we use it, like, to really to help, like, the tool, like, to help and guide development of food safety culture, this becomes something very important, as that will define what strategies would work, what strategy would not work. So you may have, like, the same scenario in, say, your country and in compare with Malaysia, but the strategy you need to put in probably need to be something different, as this slide, could actually show. Authority, in the dimension authority, in the Eastern food handler setting, Western food handler setting. So in the Eastern, it's high authority. So then probably top-down compliance-based training is very important. Whereas in the Western, so it will never work to put in a top-down compliance-based training, but a collaborative participatory training, which works better in those settings. So I'm not to go through all these due to the time constraints. So you could have it. So this is just an example to show that strategy, different way is needed for different culture for you to actually make sure that everyone follow or practice food safety. So we have actually conducted a focus group discussion to actually discuss with local Malaysia industry, to really get their perspective on what works, in implementing food safety culture within their setting. So these are the four, that has been again and again being highlighted and shared by the local industry. Is top-down approach is extremely important, effective and continuous communication, aligned communication that is say the same thing, again and again. Incentive and campaign work very well, training and education work very well in Malaysia. So what works in your country, that's something that you may need to actually look into to help you shape the food safety culture in your setting. So in conclusion, so I think the way forward is to really understand the culture within your society and your setting, your workers, culture, your institution culture, that will actually help you to strategize and design strategy that would actually work. So you need an assessment tool, to tell you where are you standing right now. So what is the temperature within your organization? And collaboration is very important between industry, government, and consumer to actually build a resilient food safety culture in the country. And with that, I end my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chay, for your presentation. I am sure that our participants learned from you regarding food safety culture. And now at this point, I will begin now my presentation, which will focus on leveraging environmental monitoring to drive a positive food safety culture. And for this talk, I will be covering 3 topics. We'll begin with a discussion on food safety and food safety culture in order for us to establish the foundational concepts and their importance. And we'll then be following it with assessing culture maturity in relation to environmental monitoring, where we will explore how the maturity of an organization's food safety culture would influence its environmental monitoring practices. During this part, I will be asking you to participate in a poll just for us to check among our participants where exactly are you right now when it comes to maturity in relation to environmental monitoring practices. I'm quite excited about that part so that we can check in APAC how are we maturing in relation to environmental monitoring. And that is something very important as we proceed to topic number 3, which is on strategies to advance culture maturity for effective environmental monitoring. For this part, I will be sharing with you some actionable approaches in order to strengthen culture and enhance your monitoring effectiveness, because I am sure that many of you would want to achieve more maturity or higher maturity when it comes to your environmental monitoring practices, but are a bit lost in terms of how you can achieve that. We will provide you with examples based on our customers' experience as we go to topic number 3. I'm really hoping that you will learn a lot with this discussion. And this is because I believe all of you will agree with me, food safety is something that is very important for all of you. It's really critical. It's your moral obligation to ensure that your customers, all of us consumers, receive food items that are free from hazards. But we also acknowledge the fact that ensuring safety of your food products does not come easy. And this is because of the fact that contaminants, some of which are hazardous, can be found throughout the environment and that these contaminants may enter your food products at any point from farm to fork. That is why it's really very important for you to truly understand food safety and at the same time develop robust food safety practices that would allow you to reduce the risk of foodborne illnesses and at the same time support the production of safe, nutritious, and high quality food products. At present, there are so many things, so many programs that are being implemented by food manufacturing companies, but one of them that has proven to be effective is, of course, environmental monitoring. Fact is, any food company at this time who is engaged in food safety would have some kind of environmental monitoring program in place. Although we have noticed that the way different companies would practice it would vary. And you will see later on in my discussion that your practice of environmental monitoring is actually a reflection of the kind of culture that exists in your company. So you're probably wondering now why environmental monitoring has become a focus in many food manufacturing companies. Well, the reason for this is because many of them has realized that having HACCP alone is not sufficient to keep many foods safe. You know very well that in HACCP, our main focus is on identifying critical control points for each hazard that is deemed likely to occur. However, for HACCP to work, it's very important for you to establish prerequisite programs, like, for example, your sanitation standard operating procedures. You need to have your personal hygiene. You need compliance to good manufacturing practices, among others. Because if you think about it, what's really the use of removing or eliminating the hazard during food production if you will not be able to successfully eliminate hazards coming from other potential sources, like, for example, the environment? It becomes useless, basically. And that is exactly the reason why, in some cases, outbreaks would happen even in companies having HACCP certification. Well, the other reason why there's a lot of focus now on environmental monitoring is because of the recognition that the environment is a significant source of these contaminants, and that if you want to effectively control or lower the risk of these contaminants getting access to your food products, it's important for you to do active monitoring and for you to manage your environment in which the food is produced. So you're probably wondering now, how exactly does the environment become a source of contaminants? Well, the reason why it becomes a source of contaminants is because you have contaminants entering your facility because of the raw materials that you are using, also possibly because of the water that you are using for cleaning or as an ingredient of your food product, and of course, because of the personnel who are entering your facility. That is the reason why very important for food manufacturing companies to have effective cleaning and sanitation procedures. The problem is if your team fails in cleaning, product residues will now be left behind. And remember, these product residues can be an indirect risk because eventually they can serve as a breeding ground for microorganisms. This would include indicators and spoilage microorganisms, like, for example, yeast and molds, lactic acid bacteria, or maybe getting very high aerobic counts when you take your samples. Of course, microorganisms would also include pathogenic microorganisms. These are the ones that have the ability to cause disease to consumers, and examples would include Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes, among others. Now, in some cases, these product residues may also be a direct risk, such as in the case of product residues which contains allergens. Very important for you to also focus on this because it is a safety issue for people who have allergic reactions. So how will you know if you are failing in removing these product residues? You're able to determine that by conducting environmental monitoring. So by recognizing these issues in your cleaning and sanitation program, this is now when you can implement effective controls so that you can prevent contamination and prevent the hazards from reaching your food products. Because of the importance of environmental monitoring, that is the reason why at Neogen, we try our very best to provide you with the tools that are necessary for you to check if you're able to control the spread of these contaminants within your facility. There are a lot more reasons why the environment is a focus now of food manufacturing companies. I have just given you only two. They may just be two, but I think those two alone already emphasize how important environmental monitoring is. And because it is so important, it is really critical that you're able to have a buy-in for environmental monitoring activities from everyone in your organization. Because no matter how well designed your environmental monitoring program is, it will still not be successful if you don't get the full support from all levels of your organization. This would include the senior management, your QA people, your production staff, basically everyone in your organization. If you want an example, imagine, having the desire to have an environmental monitoring program, but you happen to have a supervisor or manager who does not recognize that it is important, then it will be very difficult for you to have the necessary investments for equipment, for training, for testing tools, because they will not approve it, because they don't believe in the value of environmental monitoring. Of course, when you do your environmental monitoring, it's really important for you to have a goal. And that goal is, how will you be able to bring the hazards as far away as possible from your food product? And how will you be able to use your data in order to predict and mitigate the problems even before they occur? And according to experts, in order for you to achieve this too, they are saying that this would require at least a shift in the organization's culture. And the reason for this is because it is necessary for you to have a change in mindset from one that is reactive. That means you only react once an issue already happens, like for example, finding a hazard on an equipment, to an approach which is more proactive or prevention focused. If you're going to take a look at this chart, this basically gives the formula that you can use in order to achieve food safety. And this formula can also be used when it comes to implementation of an effective food safety system. This focus is really important on culture because in doing environmental monitoring, I guess you want to make sure that there's a buy-in from everyone. You may have the best programs, you may have the best systems in place, but if your people do not comply with it, it's basically useless. So this formula now emphasizes that, yes, you need to have your policies, you need to have your systems in place, but you want to make sure that everyone complies with the system, complies with your policy. And the only way you can achieve that is by having a positive food safety culture. Now, culture, when it comes to environmental monitoring, is very important. That is why in the second edition of the Environmental Monitoring Handbook, which we are, I believe, releasing this month, okay, I believe it will be released already this month, one of the key topics is dedicated to food safety culture. This handbook was actually developed by Neogen in partnership with Cornell University. And basically what we're pointing out in this handbook is that it is critical for food manufacturing companies to have a mature food safety culture that would integrate now environmental monitoring with strong leadership and a structured risk-based approach. So if you want to understand better food safety culture in relation to environmental monitoring, please make sure that you grab a copy of this handbook, which will be available for free very soon. So what is food safety culture? I think at this point it's already very clear to everyone that food safety culture goes beyond having systems, it goes beyond having policies, it goes beyond having rules within your organization. Dr. Chai emphasized earlier that this is more about shared values, beliefs, and norms that affects the mindset and behaviors toward food safety throughout the company. Okay? And every company would actually have a food safety culture. Okay? It's just a matter of knowing where you are in this continuum. For the past 20 years, working very closely with food manufacturing companies all throughout APAC, I have realized that your concerns, whether you're a multinational company, a big company, or a small company, they're basically the same. You're concerned about quality, you're concerned about safety. But how you execute it in order for you to achieve those two is where there's a difference. And that difference is actually a reflection of the culture that exists within your company. I believe for those participants who have been part of different food manufacturing companies, you know exactly what I am referring to. That what makes a company unique is the kind of culture that exists within that company. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you talk about food safety culture, it's basically a continuum. You can be on the positive side, you can be on the negative side, and you're probably wondering what differentiates a positive from a negative food safety culture. Now, for food manufacturing companies with positive food safety culture, food safety is a top priority. More than anything else, food safety is their top priority. It's a part of their food safety objectives. So for them, if they need to buy something in order for them to improve their food safety practices, they don't look at it as an additional expense. They look at it as an investment for them to reach their food safety goals. That's why if you check on their compliance, it's very high. They are complying with their documented systems because again, food safety is a top priority for them. In the case of companies with negative food safety culture, other business goals are more important than food safety. And just in case they are asked to buy something that would allow them to improve their food safety practices, they look at it as an additional expense rather than an investment. That's why if you check on compliance with documented food safety requirements is quite poor. Where are you right now? Okay, I think answering that is quite important because of the fact that food safety is a journey. Okay, you may be on the negative side at the moment, but the good news is that you can actually do something about it for your food safety culture to be changed, for it to be leaning more towards the positive side. But of course, for you to be able to do that, it's really important for you to assess, where am I right now? What is the current culture that exists in our organization so that you can take meaningful steps that would help you move forward toward a positive culture that you want to achieve. Okay. Now, a very useful reference for understanding where you currently stand in terms of culture maturity is the culture maturity model provided by Cultivate SA. Again, this organization was founded by Dr. Lone Jespersen, and they're an organization that conducts extensive studies on food safety culture. According to this model, if you look at it right now, they said that food safety culture develops into 5 stages. Stage 1 is doubt. Stage 2 is react to. Stage 3 is know of. Stage 4 is predict. And stage 5 is internalize. And as you move from stage 1 to stage 5, that is a reflection that the organization has increasing maturity in how food safety decisions are made and integrated into the company. Now, the good thing is that this same maturity model was actually used by Neogen in partnership with Cornell University in order to assess microbiological and environmental process controls within a plant. And again, if you are interested in learning more about this, you can check the detailed information in the upcoming edition of the Environmental Monitoring Handbook. Basically, in my discussion on maturity in terms of environmental monitoring, they considered three things. First is the sampling results. Where are you actually getting positives for hazards? Is it on the product or is it in your environment? Where you find positives is actually a reflection of the culture that exists within your company. They also considered here control methods. How do you prevent the spread of the hazard in your plant? And lastly, what verification methods are you using in order for you to check if your hazard is in control or if your cleaning and sanitation practices are effective? We'll go through each one of these stages, and we will start with stage one. For food manufacturing companies in stage one, basically they don't do environmental monitoring. And the reason for this is because they don't really see value or relevance to environmental monitoring. There's very little or no support from the management because they think that they are special. We operate differently and we are unique. And that is why HACCP alone is already sufficient for us. For food manufacturing companies in stage one, they do not know if they have the hazards simply because they do not look for the hazards. Just in case they would have some environmental monitoring being conducted in the plant, they only do it for compliance. Maybe it's a requirement of a customer or because there's an upcoming audit. So let's do environmental monitoring. However, their goal here is not really to find the hazard. Are you in stage one? We will find out later on. The next stage is awareness. And from the name itself, awareness, the company now becomes aware that hazards do exist in the plant. However, they do not understand yet what are the root causes or the sources of these hazards, making control now quite difficult for the company. For this plant, typically they find positives on contact surfaces. These are zone 1 test points, and they would also get positives on the product itself. At this stage, their primary focus of control is in the finished product. So they would test lots of finished product. If they get a negative, that means that they can release the product. But if they get a positive, that means that they need to hold the product because it is contaminated. At this stage, the focus of control is the means of verification is just by doing product testing. Okay. The next stage is enlightenment. And the reason why it's enlightenment is because they now know the growth niches in the plant. When you talk about growth niches, these are areas where contaminants thrive. So in stage 3, they were able to identify already the growth niches in their facilities. And the reason why they were able to find it is because of some serious incidents that happened in the plant. Maybe it's finding positive in the end product, or in some cases, they find out that they do have the hazard because of an inspection that was done, or maybe because there's an auditor who took some samples in their facility, and it turned out that the samples collected by the auditor was positive. So there's a reason for enlightenment, and it's usually because of a positive result that was found out. Now, usually for food manufacturing companies, the transition from stage 2, which is awareness, to enlightenment is one that is most challenging. This is usually the time when often the analysts would question a method. Is this test method really effective? This is also when Sometimes the performance of the analysts are being questioned. Do they really know how to do the testing? Why are they getting positive results? And most of the times at this stage, the manager would have sleepless nights because they keep on getting positives. And this happens despite the cleaning efforts that they are doing. Usually at this stage also, there's a lot of resources being utilized because they do a lot of retesting, a lot of investigations are happening. And in some cases, product recalls are being done because, again, of finding positives from end products. So are you in stage 3 right now? So please take note of those descriptions because we will be doing a poll later on. The 4th stage is preventive. When do you achieve a preventive stage? You're able to achieve this once the growth niches are brought back to an acceptable sanitary condition. Basically, you're able to eliminate now the hazards from the growth niches. And that's why if you take a look at the results, it's very rare now that you find positives in zone 1 or in the contact surface positives. In stage 4 also, the company has already mapped out the potential growth niches. So you're becoming a lot more preventive this time because, the company would now engage maybe on redesign of an equipment or maybe a facility in order to prevent a recontamination from happening. And the last stage is internalize. At this stage, the plant is now able to bring the hazard far away from the food or from the food contact surfaces. That's why you will not experience any positives in your zone 1 at this point. So in many of our customers who are already on stage 5, their main focus now would be zones that are farther, including zone 4. That's their point of control now. Now, I do understand that in achieving this shift in stage, it would require a lot of investments for the company. As you can see in the verification alone, there are a lot more to test because you want to verify that whatever controls that you have placed in your program, whatever cleaning and sanitation that you are doing, they are really working well for you. But I really believe that such investments are always worth it. I believe that when you're doing your investment for the sake of food safety, that is always worth it. And besides, having this focus on a more mature food safety culture in the company is actually very beneficial for the company. It can result in productivity gains because you will now have fewer interruptions because you don't encounter a lot of positives during production anymore. You also achieve risk mitigation because the likelihood of contamination becomes reduced now. And consequently, that will be cost reduction because there's a lot less production downtime. And lastly, it will also be useful because having more mature, you're focused now on continuous improvement so that you can now ensure quality and safety of your food products at all times for your customers. Now, I'm sure that at this point, you are wondering now, where am I in the maturity model? So what we're going to do now is to have a poll, and I'm really hoping that all of our participants, more than 300 of you who are joined now, will be honest in assessing your maturity. Okay, we are going to have 3 poll questions, and the first one is based on your sampling results. So I want you to go back to the results that you are getting right now. Where do you find the positives? Okay, are you in A? That's stage 1 doubt. That means that you don't currently perform any environmental monitoring. That's why you don't know if you have hazards in your plant. Or are you in stage 2? When you check on your positives, you are getting positives in zone 1, that's food contact surfaces, and also on your product. Or are you in stage 3, which is enlightenment? Because currently you have some intermittent positives on contact surfaces in your plant. Or are you already on stage 4? Very rare will you get positives on surfaces or test points in your plant, and you don't get any positives from your products. Or are you in stage 5? That means that your main focus now would be zone 4, and you don't have any positives anymore in your zone 1 test points. We'll give you enough time to assess your maturity in terms of sampling results. We already have a significant number of attendees who have responded, but we'll wait for some more responses so that we can have a better representation of the participants we have for this afternoon. A few more seconds before we reveal the results. I'm quite excited to know the maturity of our participants this afternoon in relation to environmental monitoring. I think we already have a significant number of respondents, so let's now reveal the maturity of our participants. Okay, so if you will notice, a majority of our customers, our participants, are already on stage 4 at 40.9. That means that you don't get any positives anymore on your zone 1. And you have rare occurrence of positives in your zone 1, and you don't get any positives anymore from your samples. Okay, followed by stage 3 at 24%, and stage 2 at 16.7%. You can see that some of our respondents were honest enough to say that they are in stage 2 and stage 1. And I'm really happy that we do have a number of participants who are already in stage 5, which means that they already have a very mature practice because of the results that they are getting whenever they do environmental monitoring. So let's now go to factor number 2. And this time, we are going to take a look at your maturity based on your control methods. Again, for stage 1, that means you're not doing any tests. For stage 2, that means that your main focus is on sample product. For stage 3, you already know where your growth niches are. In stage 4, you have already mapped potential growth niches, and you're already doing some facility or equipment redesign in your company. Or are you at stage 5, wherein your main focus now is on zone 4? Let's check now where you are right now in terms of control methods. We'll give you again time to respond to this poll question. Okay. I am very interested to know the results. I'm wondering if the results, the trend, will be similar compared to the first poll question that we had earlier. Okay. We are running a bit of time. Apologies, because we may not be able to answer a lot of questions later on, but we'll try our very best. We already have a significant number of respondents. I may need to speed it up a bit. Let's now check on the results. Based on this one, there's a slight difference because it seemed like a majority of you are more on stage 3 rather than stage 4, which was the top earlier. In terms of number of respondents in stage 2 and stage 5, it seems like they are equal. And again, thank you for the honesty for those who answered that currently you are in stage 1. We'll now go to our last poll question. And this time, this is in terms of the verification that you are doing in your plant. Again, for stage 1, you're not doing any testing at the moment. In the case of stage 2, your main focus for verification is on the results you're getting from your sample product. For stage 3, it's based on samples taken from zone 1 and also your product samples. In the case of stage 4, you are getting your samples from zone 1 and also on primary transfer vectors aside from your sample product. And for stage 5, it's a lot more intense because you basically take your samples now on all of the different zones in the plant aside from your sample product. So based on these choices, make an assessment of where you currently are right now. Okay, we already have a significant number of respondents. Let's now reveal the results of our survey. Based on this one, again, a majority of you are on stage 3. And I'm seeing that there is a lot more on stage 4 and also on stage 5, which I think is a really very good indication. Although there is still a number of food manufacturing companies that are in stage 1 and stage 2. Again, thank you very much for your honesty. I want to emphasize again, the reason why we are doing this is if you want to move forward, you really have to know where you are right now. Okay, so I'm happy that you now know that you're probably in stage 1, stage 2, and probably for some of you, your goal now is reaching stage 4 or maybe even stage 5. And you may have the question in mind now, what do I need to go? What do I need to do in order for me to get there? Okay. So this is now where I'm going to link my presentation with the presentation provided by Dr. Chay earlier. During Dr. Chay's discussion, she did mention that there are 9 factors that can actually help shape the kind of food safety culture that exists in your organization. But for the purpose of our discussion, since we have very limited time already, I will be focusing more on 4 of these factors, which include leadership, commitment, communication, and environment. What I would do in this part of the discussion is share some of the examples based on our customers' experience that you can apply hopefully in your company to strengthen your environmental monitoring practices. We'll go through each one of these factors, and I'd like to begin now with leadership. I believe all of you will agree with me that any great company would require good leaders. And when it comes to the implementation of environmental monitoring program, we definitely need good leaders. Good leaders are able to successfully engage all of the members of the organization because they're able to provide very clear directions that everyone need to take. As I mentioned earlier, when you talk about leadership, it's really about being able to successfully engage everyone in the organization. Okay? It's about being able to engage everyone in the organization when it comes to hygiene and safety performance and also in compliance. Now, when you talk about implementation of environmental monitoring programs, effective leadership is really crucial. Not only for you to start having an environmental monitoring program, but leadership is also critical in order for you to ensure success of its implementation. I believe all of you would agree that when it comes to implementing environmental monitoring programs, one of the biggest challenges is convincing the owners or top managers. Because in order for you to do it, you really need to invest. Invest on tools, invest on training, invest on people, invest on resources. Okay? So if you haven't started yet your environmental monitoring program, you're probably wondering now, how do we do it? How were the other food manufacturing companies able to establish it? How were the environmental monitoring team members able to gain the support of the owners and top management from the company? So this is something that I will share with all of you. And if you ask me, I really believe that the secret why they were able to successfully convince the top management is they were able to earn their trust. I got to attend a training on leading at the speed of trust. And one of the things that I really learned about the training is that trust is the most critical leadership competency. Because why would people be willing to be influenced by you, right? So if you think about environmental monitoring and I am the owner, why would I be willing to follow what you are recommending? Trust is necessary, okay, for me to be able to, allow you to do it. So you're probably wondering now, how do you cultivate trust? Okay, so again, I will be answering this based on the experience of our customers, and I will be citing a very specific example, and that is on the implementation of ATP testing as part of the environmental monitoring program. Environmental monitoring programs now are a lot more holistic. They do microbial testing, they test for allergens, and the other component now of environmental monitoring is on ATP testing. But based on communication with our customers, sometimes they are really having a challenge when it comes to convincing the top management to adopt this technology. But it's really important for food manufacturing companies to have this tool because ATP has been recognized as an excellent hygiene indicator. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with ATP testing, you have to understand that all biological beings, so the plants, for example, or animals, humans or personnel, dirt or microorganisms, they would all contain ATP in it. So if you do your cleaning and your team does not perform cleaning properly, these will be left behind on your equipment, right? There will be a lot of ATP on your equipment. The challenge is you cannot see ATP. So how would you have an idea now to check if you have high levels of dirt or low levels of dirt from the equipment that your team has already cleaned? This is now where ATP bioluminescence technology, you basically take samples of ATP and allow it to react with the firefly enzyme called luciferase in the presence of the substrate called luciferine. Once these react in the presence of oxygen, that is when you produce light. That light is expressed in terms of RLU, or relative light unit. And for many in the hospital market and also in food and beverage industries, they really want to bring the RLU as low as possible because that's an indication that there is low level of contamination. Because if you have high RLUs, that's a sign you have a lot of ATP because you have high levels of contamination in your plant. Now, in our system, it's called Clean Trace, and you basically use a swab. That swab contains several reagents, and what's included is the extractant that would allow you to release the ATP from the cells that you have collected. Now, that ATP that you have collected will now be allowed to react with the luciferase enzyme, which is found in the cuvette. Okay, so you combine them together, and then you get the results by making use of a luminometer. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about this technology, again, do not forget to connect with anyone from Neogen and our distribution partners, because it has been proven that this tool allows food manufacturing companies to have a preventive approach when it comes to food safety. But justifying it may be a challenge. And based on our customers' experience, one of the things that allow them to convince the management and owners is by having the competence in the technology that they want to adopt in their company. And part of getting that competence is making sure that you have enough technical knowledge about the system that you want to adopt. And in the case of ATP technology, that, of course, would be knowing how does ATP testing work. Basically, what I have shared earlier, that is how ATP testing work. And you need to know that in order for you to explain it to your managers. It's also important that you have examples on how ATP testing has helped other food manufacturing companies, especially in industries very much related to the industry where you are playing at, so that you can convince further, the decision makers in adopting this technology. Of course, part of technical knowledge is knowing exactly what to look for in an ATP test. There may be several options available in the market, and the reality is they don't perform equally. So you may want to consider sensitivity, repeatability, reproducibility, among others, and you want to make sure that there is evidence that the claim is really solid. So fortunately, there are literatures and studies that can be provided by Neogen, just in case you are interested in knowing more about our clean trace technology. But let's face it, having technical knowledge alone is not enough. It's also important for you to have operational knowledge. And that would include knowing how your plant currently operates so that you know exactly when to apply the technology that you want to adopt in your plant. So in the case of ATP testing, it's really very important for you to emphasize to the decision makers that adopting this technology would not result in disruption in your normal process in the company. It's also important for you to know exactly when to use it. And that is after cleaning, before sanitation in many of our customers. And you also want to make sure that you're able to emphasize that the data can actually be managed by a software that would allow you to do tracking well. And you can also utilize this software whenever there are audits in your company. So technical knowledge is very important, and it must be coupled by operational knowledge. But if you have this too, in some cases, it may still not lead into successful conversion because there's a third component that you need to have, and that is political knowledge. Who can support you in the adoption of this technology? So it's very important for you to know now who among your team members are proponents of food safety, who are influencers, like for example, your QA people or maybe your plant managers, so that you don't work alone. You have team members with you. And you want to make sure also and stress and work with your regulatory compliance in order for you to solidify the claim that having an ATP system would allow you to be more compliant with food safety regulations. And of course, for owners, you want to make sure that you're able to present a return of investment, that in the end, what your company will be able to achieve is higher quality, maybe lesser rejection rate of your products. And again, the reason why I am emphasizing the value of ATP is because among our customers, it has really resulted in great behavioral change, allowing them to have better practices when it comes to food safety. And again, if you want to know more about these things, do connect with us because we have proofs to indicate that ATP testing really drives behavioral change. But of course, having competence alone is not enough. It's important for you to combine it with character. Character is very crucial with regards to the implementation of ATP testing as part of the environmental monitoring program because of the reality that some of the results that you will get may be hard to accept in some cases, like very high RLU levels. But if you have integrity and if you have fair treatment to everyone, I think you will be able to get the support more of your people. And I think it's really about really showing that adopting a program or a technology or a system can really help you improve further in ensuring safety of your food products. And lastly, based again on our customers' experience, they also coupled successful implementation of ATP testing by establishing a connection. So I really hope that you're able to share the data that you are generating with your team and allow your team to take part in providing recommendations on how you can improve further the results that you are getting. I'm really hoping also that your data will also help solidify the training programs that you have in your company by knowing exactly who needs further training and who among your team members are doing such a great job when it comes to implementation of your environmental monitoring program. So again, I want to emphasize trust is really important when it comes to leadership, and that strong leadership is something that can help you have a more mature food safety culture in your company. Let's now move on to the next factor, and that is commitment. To be honest with you, I really find commitment one of the most valuable factors that you have to consider because of the fact that when you do food safety, there are so many things that you have to do which may be inconvenient. Take the case of cleaning and sanitation. You need a lot of resources. You need a lot of, a lot of time. Sometimes you need to wake up very early in order for you to clean the plant. It's very convenient. But I really believe that once you're able to get your people's commitment, no matter how inconvenient they may be, they will still do it. And you want to make sure that you get the commitment of your team to do everything right in the best way every time. Now, it's important that when you get that commitment, you get it from everyone, because food safety is really a team sport. And I always want to look at a food safety team as a chain. Just like any chain, you are as strong as your weakest link. So if 98 of your team members are doing food safety wholeheartedly, but you have 2 who are not really focused too much on food safety, that may still be a reason for you to fail. So commitment is really something that hopefully you get to achieve. And you're probably wondering, what are some food manufacturing companies doing in order to get the commitment to do everything right every time? This is now where the value of rewards and incentives come in. It's very important for you to reward outstanding behaviors, and they are saying that sometimes a simple thank you or a message of good job or great job is already a motivation for your people to do their job even better. But of course, it's still good to have some recognition, like providing certificates or gift certificates to your people if they are doing environmental monitoring properly. Of course, you want to make sure that you also have high-performing programs for your teams and also for individuals. These are people who would really make great contributions when it comes to achieving favorable environmental monitoring in your company. And of course, you also want to make sure that you provide recognition for those who are giving you the results that you want. Now, just to share, one of the awards that was given by our customers is the Cleanest Kitchen Award using clean trays. You know, in hotels, ensuring cleanliness in kitchen is really very critical for food safety. And again, for them to be able to do that, they need to clean properly. So what they did was to make use of the clean trays hygiene monitoring system, tabulate the results, and then at the end of every month, whichever kitchen would have the lowest RLU readings are being recognized. And the reward is really pretty simple. It's about posting the name of the kitchen and also the personnel in that kitchen in their bulletin board, indicating that they were able to achieve the Cleanest Kitchen Award for that month. We also had some customers who would make rewards, like for example, Cleanest Hands Award, in order to drive improvement when it comes to hand washing practices. Quite simple, but I think collaboration with HR is really key here in order for you to drive improvement on food safety practices. And I always emphasize to our customers that the good thing about having a reward system is that if you're asking 100%, if they know that they will be rewarded for doing something great, they can always go beyond that, ensuring greater food safety in your company. The third one is communication. Communication is key. If you want to have improvement, communication needs to be clear. And you want to make sure that you are transferring the correct information to your team. Nowadays, there are so many options available for you to communicate. You can do it via email, you can have your meetings, you can have one-on-ones, you can do trainings like this. But you want to make sure that you're able to pick the one that will be most effective for your people. So two things you have to remember: make sure that you're providing them with the correct information, and you want to make sure that your choice is effective for your people. Now, one thing that I want to warn all of you is that noises do exist. And when I talk about noises, this is not the literal noise. These are actually interruptions on the flow of information. And one of the things that you have to be very careful about is the wrong information that has been upheld by some of your people. For the longest time, that they have believed that it is a correct information. Like, for example, this thinking. Okay? Some people believe that as long as you put sanitizer, microorganisms will die. And some people even believe that as soon as you put the sanitizer, all of the microorganisms will die simultaneously, which is, of course, incorrect. So it's very important for you to emphasize to your team members regarding environmental monitoring that there are many factors that could affect sanitation times. You want to make sure that there's enough contact time. You want to make sure that they are using the right concentration, and that they do cleaning first in order to remove the product residues, because of the fact that this may affect the performance of your sanitizers. And you also want to make sure that they are applying the chemicals properly in order to optimize the performance of your sanitizers. So again, you have to guard your people from wrong information like this. I'll give you another example. Some people, they believe that it's okay if it's not properly clean. Besides, we are going to apply sanitizer later on. Okay? Very alarming, right? Because you know very well that something that is not clean cannot be considered safe, based again on what I have shared earlier, that they may serve as breeding grounds for microorganisms, and that some of them may contain allergenic components. Again, I also want to emphasize that dirt that is left behind on the equipment may also affect the performance of the sanitizers that you are using. So very important, safeguard your people from these wrong information. The other thing that you want your people to be safeguarded from or with is, of course, distortion of the message. Like sometimes there are supervisors that would say, that's already okay, or speed it up, which may be a distortion of the message for some people. Especially, for example, if there's someone like maybe you have seen that the equipment is still not really clean, and then all of a sudden your manager says that's already okay. Or maybe sometimes you have undergone a training, and based on the training, you have to satisfy the contact time of 15 minutes, but your manager is already speeding you up. So the manager is encouraging shortcuts in the process of cleaning. These are distortions of the message, because you said that food safety is important, but why are you making us, not comply with the food safety requirements of the company? So be careful also with your messages like this. And this is now where the value of education and training comes in. You want to make sure that when you conduct your trainings, they will result in a behavioral change. If you're doing training for the sake of training, they are useless. You want to make sure that your people will show a change in their behavior after you have conducted the training. And based on the trainings that I have attended, they are recommending that if you're going to do training, make sure that they become aware of the consequences of their failure. Like, for example, they don't wash properly, or if allergens are left behind, what will be the impact on the consumers? Or if there will be Listeria monocytogenes because I don't do cleaning properly, what will be the effect of that to the consumers? Sometimes real life stories is also quite effective. And you want to make sure that if you're making use of tools or, for example, videos, you want to make sure that they are quite simple, easily understood by your people, so that, again, you will be able to achieve behavioral change, which will consequently result in an improvement in the food safety practices in your plant. And of course, after you have done your training, your education programs, you want to make sure that there is reinforcement. So make sure that you have videos available just for your people to be constantly reminded, or maybe posters. And again, my recommendation is you want to make sure that they are understood by your people. So if you're not a natural English speaker, or you're using an entirely different dialect, please refrain from using language or dialects which will be challenging for your people to understand. You want to make sure it's effective. Okay. Now, when it comes to communication, again, I want to go back to my example earlier on ATP testing, because ATP testing has been shown by our customers to be effective in strengthening food safety culture by supporting employee involvement and communication. So again, this is now where some of our customers identify who needs further training. And I actually placed here an example. This is actually an actual example that we have obtained from a customer. They are doing their monitoring daily. The red line that you see in the figure represents the fail limit, and the green line is the pass limit. And if you will notice on the results that they are getting, every weekend, that is when they would get failed results. During weekdays, they would always get favorable results. That means that they are within the pass limit. And when they conducted the investigation, they found out that the team who is performing cleaning on weekends is actually a different team. So by making use of the data generating a figure like this using the software, they were able to identify who among their cleaning teams need further training. Now, aside from that, use of ATP testing can also strengthen food safety culture by providing insights from data in order to identify early warnings and drive continuous improvement. And I want everyone to focus on the figure on the right side. If you will notice, all of the results that they were able to obtain are within the pass limits. And sometimes, whenever we're doing our testing, we have the tendency to look at data on a daily basis without realizing that doing trending provides us with a lot of information. If you will notice, yes, the results they are getting are pass, but if you check on the trend, it's actually increasing and getting closer to the fail limit. Because they conducted trending analysis, they were able to provide actions so that they were able to bring again the RLU results to a lower level. Such an improvement when it comes to their cleaning and sanitation practices. So in the case of some of our customers, what they actually do is to constantly challenge their past levels. So they would start with 150. After some time, they would lower it to 100. In some cases, they lower it further to 75 or 50. And they realize that by challenging their team members, it actually drives them to do cleaning even further. As you can see in the results, the RLU levels that they are achieving actually gets lower and lower by simply challenging the past levels that they are using in their company. So by making use of programs like this, generating data, doing trending analysis, they are able to improve quality and ensure safety of their food products even more. And lastly, environment. This is my personal recommendation. Whenever you create programs related to food safety, please make sure that your environment is ready for it. I always cite this as an example. I would go to one plant, they would ask me to have attend a seminar on their food safety practices. They would ask me to read 3 pages of food safety practices. And then when I was about to do the first step, which is hand washing, I go to the washing area, I would find out that there's actually no soap provided. So you become a laughing stock, right? Because you have very good program, but you're not able to let your people and guests like me do it simply because you did not prepare the environment for them to comply with food safety practices. So please make sure that you are ready with your environment. And part of it, when you're talking about environmental monitoring, is of course providing them with the tools necessary in order for them to do cleaning and sanitation properly. This would, of course, include water facilities, adequate water supply, and etc. But more than that, you also want to make sure that you provide your people with the tools necessary for them to assess the performance of their cleaning and sanitation teams. And again, I want to emphasize when it comes to environmental monitoring tools, it's not solely now dependent on microorganisms. It's not sufficient to have just ATP testing and allergen testing. Experts are recommending for you to have a more holistic approach because of the reality that not a single tool will be able to provide you with all of the information that you need. So you want to have all the necessary tools in order for you to have a very good assessment of the cleaning and sanitation practices in your plant. And this is something that you really have to prepare on, providing them with all of these tools and again, preparing your environment because of one very important factor, perceived organizational support or POS. It has been found on studies that when your people has a perception that food safety is not important because the facilities needed or the tools needed to comply with food safety practices are not provided, people have a thinking that food safety is not important for my company. However, if you have sufficient facilities, you provide them with the right cleaning and sanitation tools, you provide them with the tools necessary for them to assess environmental monitoring, their perception is that the company really prioritizes food safety. So again, please make sure that you level up the POS in your company so that your people now becomes a lot more engaged to food safety related behaviors. Okay. So I'm about to end. And again, I just want to emphasize once again on the value of having a mature food safety culture to food manufacturing companies. And you're probably asking now, is there a proof that would show that having more matured food safety culture is really beneficial for the company? And I'm happy that there's actually one proof. This was based on the study conducted by Dr. Noam Jespersen. This study involved 21 food manufacturing companies. And in this study, they interviewed 1,273 leaders in the executive, management, and supervisory roles. During the study, they obtained two important information. The first one is the participants in the survey were asked to rate their company based on food safety culture maturity. And the researchers also gathered the cost of the companies of failure. How much are they spending when it comes to product recalls or products that are held or destroyed due to contamination, among others? And what they did was to tabulate it. And the results are actually what you're seeing on your screen right now. Based on the results of their study, they found out that as the cost of poor quality decreases, represented by the white line, it's actually decreased as the food safety culture of the company becomes more mature. So you're asking again, is it worth investing in making food safety culture more mature in the company? It's really worth the investment. Okay. So in summary, I just want to emphasize again that environmental monitoring has been proven to be an effective food safety strategy in food companies. However, its success would depend on the implementation of environmental monitoring in relation to the food safety culture that exists within the company. I have presented to you in our session this afternoon that there are 5 stages of maturity, and that it is important for you to recognize where you are right now and where you want to be so that you can create programs that would allow you to achieve it. I've also presented to you the maturity model based on Cultivate SA that your companies can use in relation to microbiological or environmental process controls, and that there are strategies that you can use in order to bring the maturity level to a higher one. Thank you very much for joining my part of the session. I hope that I was able to provide you with some information that you can use in making your practices on environmental monitoring better, so that you can safeguard your products from contamination even better.